44,000 people came to hear Elvis Presley sing that night. Instead, for 20 seconds, they watched him disappear. Not physically, something far stranger than that. In the middle of one of the biggest performances of his entire career, Elvis Presley suddenly stopped singing and stared into empty space as if someone invisible had stepped into the room. Nobody understood what they were witnessing, not then. And by the time the truth surfaced decades later, it had become one of the most chilling moments of Elvis Presley's life. March 11th, 1970, Houston, Texas. The Astrodome stood like a giant steel planet against the night sky. Bright lights cut through the darkness. Cars packed every parking lot. Thousands of fans streamed toward the entrances, their excitement spilling into the warm evening air. Inside, the atmosphere felt alive. 44,000 people. The largest indoor audience Elvis Presley had ever faced. The largest room he had ever played. People had traveled for hours just to be there. Some had driven across state lines. Some had spent money they couldn't afford to spend. Some simply wanted to tell their grandchildren one day, "I saw Elvis." And tonight, Elvis was giving 6 performances across 3 days, an achievement few artists on earth could even imagine. Everything about the event felt historic. Everything felt victorious. But hidden beneath the celebration was a reality almost nobody understood. The king had rebuilt his throne. He had not escaped his ghosts. Backstage, musicians moved through familiar routines. Guitars were tuned, microphones tested. Assistants rushed through hallways carrying schedules and equipment. The machine of a major Elvis Presley show was running perfectly, and at the center of it all stood Elvis himself. Calm, confident, smiling. To everyone around him, he looked exactly as he should. But appearances can be dangerous things, because sometimes a person can carry an entire storm behind a single smile. By 1970, Elvis was living through one of the greatest comebacks in entertainment history. Only a few years earlier, many critics had quietly assumed his best days were behind him. They were wrong. Spectacularly wrong. The 1968 comeback special had reminded the world who Elvis Presley was. Las Vegas had exploded. Record sales surged. Concert tickets vanished within hours. Everywhere he went, crowds followed. He wasn't fading. He was rising again. Yet success has a cruel habit. It gives the world reasons to celebrate while leaving private wounds untouched. There were losses Elvis never truly recovered from. Memories he carried into every hotel room, every stage, every city. Some people learned to live with grief. Others simply learned to hide it. The roar of the crowd suddenly echoed through the backstage corridors. Showtime. The audience had sensed movement. The anticipation spread like electricity. Elvis adjusted his outfit, took a breath, then stepped toward the stage. The reaction was immediate. A tidal wave of sound crashed through the Astrodome. 44,000 voices erupted at once. People jumped to their feet. Women screamed. Men shouted. Flashbulbs exploded like tiny stars throughout the darkness. For a moment, the building itself seemed to shake. This wasn't merely applause. It was devotion. And standing at the center of it was a man who had become larger than music, larger than fame, almost larger than life itself. Elvis smiled. The crowd grew louder. Then the show began. The first songs landed perfectly. Every movement generated cheers. Every joke drew laughter. Every lyric pulled the audience deeper into his world. The voice was strong, powerful, confident. He looked comfortable, relaxed, like a man exactly where he belonged. From the audience, it seemed impossible that anything could go wrong. From the stage, it felt like complete control. The night continued building momentum, song after song, applause after applause.
Everything flowing exactly as planned. Then came one of the songs everyone had been waiting for, Suspicious Minds. The opening notes rolled across the Astrodome. The crowd exploded again. People instantly recognized it. Some stood on their chairs. Others sang before Elvis even reached the first line. The energy inside the stadium surged. This wasn't simply another song. It was one of the defining songs of his comeback. One of the songs that had helped bring Elvis Presley back to the top. The band locked into the rhythm. Perfect, precise, professional. Elvis stepped forward. The spotlight followed. And thousands of voices joined him. The first verse landed beautifully, then the second. The audience was completely locked in. Nobody looked away. Nobody wanted to miss a second. Everything felt larger than life. The lights, the music, the cheers, the emotion. Then, something changed. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just enough. A tiny shift. The kind of shift people only recognize later, years later, after they've replayed the memory 1,000 times. Elvis reached the second verse. His voice carried across the enormous building. The band followed every beat. The audience leaned closer. Then, he stopped. The words vanished. The singing ended. The microphone remained in front of him, but Elvis Presley stopped. At first, nobody reacted. The musicians assumed it was intentional. Elvis often controlled tension masterfully. He knew exactly how to make an audience wait. So the band continued. One measure, then another. Still no vocals. The musicians exchanged glances. Something felt wrong. Another measure passed. Still nothing. Now confusion appeared. Because Elvis wasn't preparing to sing. He wasn't signaling. He wasn't joking. He wasn't moving. He was standing completely still. The realization spread through the band. This wasn't part of the show. One by one, instruments began to fade. The sound slowly drained from the stadium. Guitar, bass, drums, everything falling away. Until an unsettling quiet settled over the Astrodome. 44,000 people. And suddenly, nobody knew what was happening. The microphone worked. The speakers worked. The instruments worked. Everything worked. Everything except whatever was happening inside Elvis Presley. Seconds passed. 5, 10, 15, 20. To the audience, it felt much longer. Because Elvis wasn't looking at them. That was the part witnesses never forgot. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He wasn't looking at the band. He wasn't looking anywhere people expected. Instead, his eyes were fixed above them, far above them, toward the massive roof of the Astrodome, toward empty space, toward something nobody else could see. A chill moved through parts of the audience, not because they understood what was happening, because they didn't. And uncertainty is often more frightening than certainty. Elvis's face had changed. Not dramatically, not enough for cameras to capture, but enough. Enough for people paying close attention, enough for people who knew him, enough for people standing close to the stage. The expression wasn't confusion, it wasn't fear, it wasn't illness. It looked like recognition, as though he had suddenly seen someone unexpected, someone impossible, someone who did not belong there. The entire stadium waited. Nobody moved. Nobody understood. The king stood frozen beneath the spotlight,
while 44,000 people held their breath. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. A blink, a breath, a subtle movement of the eyes. The distant look disappeared. Elvis glanced toward the musicians, found his place in the song instantly, and started singing again. Perfectly. No explanation, no apology, no hesitation, as though nothing had happened. The crowd erupted. The music surged back to life. The concert continued. Most fans accepted the moment and moved on. A dramatic pause, a performer being theatrical, nothing more. That was the easy explanation,
The comfortable explanation. The wrong explanation. Because hidden among those 44,000 people were 3 witnesses who understood immediately that something extraordinary had just happened. One stood only a few feet away on stage. One sat behind a mixing board. One watched from the audience. And years later, their stories would fit together like pieces of a puzzle. A puzzle that led to a private conversation backstage. A conversation that ended with 3 words. 3 words Elvis Presley never publicly explained. 3 words that would turn 20 strange seconds into one of the most haunting mysteries of his life. 3 words that pointed towards someone who had been gone for 12 years. Someone Elvis never stopped missing. Someone he claimed to have seen that night. Most of the 44,000 people inside the Houston Astrodome forgot the pause before they even reached their cars. By midnight, many were talking about their favorite song, their favorite moment. The excitement of seeing Elvis Presley live. The strange 20 seconds in the middle of Suspicious Minds faded into the background. Just another small detail in a great concert. But not for everyone. Because 3 people left that building carrying a feeling they could not explain. A feeling that would follow them for decades. A feeling that something impossible had happened right in front of them. And the first person who knew it wasn't part of the show was standing only a few feet away when it happened. James Burton. If Elvis Presley was the king, James Burton was one of the men closest to the throne. By 1970, he knew Elvis better than almost anyone on stage. Night after night, show after show, city after city. He had learned something most fans never could. He knew the difference between Elvis performing a moment and Elvis experiencing one. The difference was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. The best musicians develop an unusual skill after years on stage. They learn to read tiny changes, a glance, a breath, a movement of the hands, a shift in posture. Signals most people never notice. James Burton had spent enough time beside Elvis to recognize those signals instantly. And on March 11, 1970, something felt wrong. Years later, when a music journalist researching Elvis's later years asked James about the Houston Astrodome show, he didn't talk about the crowd. He didn't talk about the music. He didn't talk about the record-breaking attendance. He talked about the pause. Because even after decades had passed, that was the moment he remembered. Not the beginning, not the ending. The pause. The 20 seconds. The moment Elvis stopped singing. According to James, the first thing that struck him wasn't the silence. It was Elvis's face. At first glance, nothing dramatic appeared to happen. No panic, no fear, no visible distress. But James noticed something that sent a chill through him. Elvis looked absent. Not distracted, absent. As though part of him had suddenly left the stage. As though his body remained under the spotlight, while his mind stood somewhere else entirely. James kept playing for a moment, waiting for the next lyric, waiting for the next cue, waiting for Elvis to continue.
But the cue never came. And as the seconds stretched longer, a strange realization began forming in his mind. Elvis wasn't forgetting the words. He wasn't confused. He wasn't searching for his place in the song. It looked as though he was looking at something nobody else could see. James would later describe the expression as familiar. That was the unsettling part, because he had seen it before, only once, and never on stage. The memory came rushing back. Las Vegas, the night before Elvis's legendary comeback performances. Back then, the pressure had been enormous. The world was watching. Critics were waiting. Fans were hoping. Nobody knew whether Elvis Presley could truly reclaim what had once been his. The future of his career seemed to hang in the balance. And according to James, there had been a moment backstage when Elvis looked exactly the way he looked during those 20 seconds in Houston. Quiet, distant, lost in something nobody else could access. The same expression, the same stare, the same feeling. A man standing in front of you, while somehow being somewhere else. That memory returned instantly when Elvis froze during Suspicious Minds, and James never forgot it. But he wasn't the only one. Hundreds of feet away from the stage sat another witness, a man whose job was to solve problems, a man trained to find explanations. His name was Robert Chance, and his first reaction was completely different. Because, unlike James Burton, Robert wasn't looking at Elvis. He was looking at equipment.
The instant Elvis stopped singing, Robert's brain went into professional mode. Something failed. That was his first assumption. Microphone, cable, mixing board, signal chain. There had to be a technical reason. After 15 years working live sound, technical problems were always the most likely explanation. Equipment fails, machines break, connections drop. Simple, logical, understandable. So Robert immediately began checking everything. The microphone signal, the audio feed, the board, the levels, every system he could monitor. And what he discovered made no sense. Everything was working perfectly. Every indicator showed normal operation. Nothing had failed. Nothing had broken. Nothing explained why Elvis Presley had suddenly stopped singing. Robert looked back toward the stage, and that was when his certainty disappeared. Because the problem wasn't the equipment. The problem was Elvis. For the next 20 seconds, Robert watched carefully, trying to understand, trying to diagnose, trying to find a rational explanation. But the longer he watched, the less certain he became. Over the years, Robert had witnessed almost every kind of stage emergency imaginable. Artists forgetting lyrics, artists freezing from fear, artists suffering panic attacks, artists becoming physically ill, artists collapsing. He had seen it all. Yet this didn't resemble any of them. Not even close. Elvis wasn't panicking. He wasn't confused. He wasn't struggling. He wasn't sick. If anything, he looked calm, almost peaceful, and somehow that made the moment even stranger. Because people usually don't wear peaceful expressions when something goes wrong. Robert couldn't explain what he was seeing, but one thought stayed with him, one thought that never left. Years later, when he described the incident, his words would become one of the most chilling observations connected to the entire story. He said, "I don't know what he was looking at." Then he paused and added, "But he was seeing something that wasn't in that room." Not imagining, not guessing, seeing. The statement sent chills through everyone who heard it, because it matched exactly what James Burton had felt. Two men, different jobs, different perspectives, the same conclusion. Something had happened.
something neither could explain, yet neither of them knew the most important piece of the puzzle. That piece was sitting in the audience. Only a short distance from the stage, watching carefully, observing everything. And unlike the others, she possessed a background that made her interpret the moment very differently. Her name was Ruth Stapleton. Most people knew her as an author and counselor. Years later, many would know her for another reason. She was the sister of a man who would eventually become President of the United States. But on March 11th, 1970, none of that mattered. What mattered was her experience. For years, Ruth had worked with people who described extraordinary spiritual encounters, people who claimed they had felt presences, people who believed they had experienced moments beyond ordinary explanation. Whether others believed those stories didn't matter. Ruth had spent enough time listening to them that she had developed a sensitivity to certain moments. And when Elvis stopped singing, she felt one immediately. Something about the atmosphere changed. Not the sound, not the lighting, the feeling, the emotional temperature of the room. She watched Elvis carefully. The silence, the stare, the expression, the return. And when the concert ended, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Most people left carrying memories. Ruth left carrying questions. Questions powerful enough that she made a decision. She wanted to speak to Elvis personally. Not tomorrow, not next week, that night. Through contacts connected to the event, she arranged an introduction backstage.
And hours later, she found herself walking through restricted corridors beneath the Astrodome. The concert was over. The noise was gone. The crowd had disappeared into the Texas night. Only staff members remained, road crews, assistants, security, musicians. And somewhere beyond a series of doors sat Elvis Presley. The closer Ruth came, the stronger her curiosity became. Because she wasn't interested in celebrity. She wasn't interested in autographs. She wasn't interested in fame. She wanted one answer. What happened during those 20 seconds? Finally, the moment arrived. The introduction was made. The two met backstage. The conversation began politely, briefly, casually, until Ruth decided to ask the question nobody else had asked. The question that had followed her since the moment Elvis froze beneath the spotlight. She looked directly at him and spoke softly. "I noticed something during the show." Elvis looked at her. She continued. The pause. A silence followed. Not uncomfortable, not defensive, just quiet. For a moment, Elvis said nothing. Then something changed in his eyes, and Ruth suddenly realized he knew exactly what she was talking about. The pause, the 20 seconds, the moment. He remembered all of it. Slowly, she asked the question. What happened? Elvis stared at her. And according to a letter discovered decades later, what happened next would become one of the most haunting moments of his entire life. Because after a long silence, Elvis Presley finally answered. And the answer consisted of only 3 words. 3 words that would connect the Houston Astrodome to a woman who had died 12 years earlier. 3 words that would explain why 44,000 people suddenly disappeared from Elvis's world. 3 words that Ruth Stapleton never forgot. 3 words that changed everything. For more than 30 years, nobody knew what Elvis Presley said backstage that night. The concert ended. The crowd went home. The lights inside the Houston Astrodome went dark. And the strange 20-second pause
slowly disappeared into history. At least, that is what people thought. But some moments refuse to stay buried. Some moments wait patiently in the shadows until the world is finally ready to hear them. And this was one of those moments. Because years after the concert, researchers uncovered a letter written by Ruth Stapleton, a private letter. Never intended for headlines, never intended for television, never intended for public attention. Just one person describing something she had witnessed, something she never forgot. According to that letter, after the show ended and she was introduced to Elvis backstage, she gathered the courage to ask him about the pause, the moment, the 20 seconds, the silence that had swallowed an entire stadium. She told him she had noticed it. She told him she couldn't stop thinking about it. And then she asked the question, "What happened out there?" For a moment, Elvis didn't answer. The noise of the concert was gone now. No screaming fans, no flashing cameras, no music. Just a quiet room and a question hanging between two people. Ruth later wrote that Elvis looked at her differently after she asked. Not surprised, not offended, almost relieved, as though someone had finally noticed what everyone else had missed. Then he spoke. 3 words. 3 simple words. Words so ordinary that they should not have carried so much weight, yet they changed everything. I saw my mother. Ruth froze. For a second, she thought she had misunderstood. Maybe he was speaking metaphorically. Maybe he meant a memory. Maybe he meant a feeling. But according to her account, the expression on Elvis's face told a different story. He wasn't speaking in poetry. He wasn't making a joke. He wasn't being symbolic. He meant exactly what he said. I saw my mother. And suddenly, those 20 seconds became something entirely different. Because Elvis Presley wasn't talking about a living woman. He was talking about Gladys Presley, his mother, the person who had shaped his world more than anyone else, the person whose loss had left a wound that never truly healed. Gladys Presley had died in August 1958, only 46 years old. Elvis was devastated. Friends would later describe him as a man shattered by grief. The bond between mother and son had been extraordinary, even by the standards of a close family. They weren't simply family, they were inseparable. Before the fame, before the fortune, before the screaming crowds, before the private jets, there had been Elvis, and there had been Gladys. She had believed in him long before the rest of the world did, when nobody knew his name, when nobody cared, when success was still only a dream. She stood beside him, and then she was gone. People often assume grief fades with time, but some losses don't fade. They simply become part of who you are. Years pass, life moves forward, success arrives, the world changes. Yet somewhere deep inside, the absence remains. 12 years had passed since Gladys died. 12 years. An entire lifetime for some people. But not for Elvis. Not really. Because there are certain people we never stop carrying. And according to Ruth's account, on March 11th, 1970, during the biggest indoor performance of his career, Elvis suddenly saw the one person he wished could have been there, his mother. Think about that for a moment. 44,000 people surrounded him, the largest crowd he had ever performed for indoors. A historic moment, a triumphant moment, a moment that represented everything he had become, and yet none of it mattered. Not for those 20 seconds. Because if Ruth's account was correct, Elvis wasn't standing in front of 44,000 fans anymore. Emotionally, mentally, spiritually, whatever word someone chooses,
He was somewhere else. Somewhere beyond the stadium, beyond the lights, beyond the music, beyond the applause. Somewhere only he could see. Years later, when researchers compared the testimonies connected to that night, something remarkable emerged. James Burton, Robert Chance, Ruth Stapleton. 3 different people, 3 different perspectives, 3 separate memories, and yet all 3 pointed toward the same conclusion. James Burton remembered Elvis looking as though he had gone somewhere else. Robert Chance believed Elvis was seeing something that wasn't in the room. And Ruth Stapleton received an explanation that fit both observations perfectly. Not proof, not certainty, but a picture that seemed strangely complete. The guitarist saw absence. The engineers saw a mystery. The counselor heard the answer. Like 3 pieces of a puzzle finally locking together. Of course, questions remained. Many questions. Could Ruth's memory have been mistaken? Could grief have shaped the story? Could Elvis have been speaking metaphorically? Researchers debated those possibilities, and one fact remained important. Peter Guralnick, the respected Elvis biographer who later received James Burton's and Robert Chance's accounts, was never able to independently verify Ruth's story directly. She had passed away years earlier. That uncertainty remains. It always will. But what makes the story endure isn't certainty, it's possibility. Because some stories survive, not because they can be proven, but because they reveal something true about the human heart. And this story reveals something many people understand. Success cannot replace love. Fame cannot replace family. Applause cannot heal every wound. On March 11, 1970, Elvis Presley stood at the summit of his performing career. The lights were brighter than ever, the crowds larger than ever, the admiration greater than ever.
Everything he had worked for stood before him. Yet, if the story is true, the person he wanted to share that moment with was the one person who wasn't there. The one person who never got to see what her son became. Gladys Presley never saw the comeback. She never saw Las Vegas. She never saw the record-breaking crowds. She never saw the legend at his peak. She never sat in the audience and watched 44,000 people rise to their feet for her son. Life had taken her before any of that happened. And perhaps that is why this story continues to resonate. Because whether someone believes the event was supernatural, psychological, emotional, or simply a powerful memory surfacing at the wrong moment, the meaning remains the same. For 20 seconds, the biggest room Elvis Presley had ever played stopped mattering. The crowd disappeared. The music disappeared. The stadium disappeared. Everything disappeared, except a son and the memory of the woman who had loved him before the world did. Then the moment passed. Elvis blinked, looked back toward the band, found his place in the song, and continued singing. The audience cheered. The music returned. The show moved forward, just as life always does. But somewhere inside those 20 seconds lives a possibility that continues to haunt everyone who hears the story. A son standing at the height of his success. A mother who never got to witness it. And one brief moment when, somehow, that distance seemed to disappear. For 20 seconds, beneath the roof of the Houston Astrodome, 44,000 people watched Elvis Presley stop singing. Most never knew why. But if the stories are true, Elvis wasn't looking at the crowd. He wasn't looking at the stage. He wasn't looking at history. For 20 unforgettable seconds, he was looking at his mother. And perhaps, for the very first time, she was seeing him too.